Hello everyone, today we talk about the Archaic Roman military mentality in the 4th century BC, in the time in which, as we've seen, Rome really takes off as a war machine and starts subjugating an incredible amount of people compared to her own manpower and resources. We haven't really talked so much about warfare per se. You realize that we have tried to give a dimension of the political and social dynamics, and therefore also assessing the scale of Roman warfare during this period. So I plan, once I finish with this kind of frame, to pass to something more strictly military, probably also history of battles and campaigns and strategic thinking in general. Definitely, however, studying mindset, right, and something that normally you do not find approached other than in a very secular and modern sense, right? Why did what is that we can say about this system, for example, and say how could we even do this, for example, without studying religion, right? Indo-Europeistics, the Roman religion, mythology, and so on, connected with these historical events, because the same sources we read are not the modern secular thing. They are basically, again, some sagas that the late Republican Romans tried to make sense of in a more, again, a secular modern fashion, but that also were deeply soaked into that mentality that we have now come to approach as if all that didn't matter, as if all that tradition and the meaning behind that was not there, right? At this point I made a substantial amount of videos about Roman history and warfare. I think we surpassed definitely the 100 from quite a while, and I plan on expanding also a bit on Roman history, the early empire, because I realize many of you asked me, at least, and it's always a topic that receives attention, a bit of an evergreen. Except, again, I think it's important to tell in ways that perhaps maybe you asked me that because I approached them from history of religion point of view. We have to come back on that too, right? There are some other peoples that deserve, in this sense. We did cover something properly about Rome, the sense of moral superiority, what was behind that, what is that Rome actually achieved and why, and what was the purpose of that in the first place. And it's also an endless topic, really, because, for example, in this inquiry now about the scale of Roman warfare and the early conquest, essentially the conquest of Italy, we have seen also a bit of that feudal background that is also not very much popularized regarding the Roman origins and ancestral kind of system. That also is really crucial. The fact that we know relatively few about the period is not an excuse, actually, for what we can really appreciate. I realize this mostly giving a look at, say, post-World War II, or kind of more socialistic type of say, or at least socialistically influenced type of historiography from the early 20th century, and I realized definitely that, especially by the first standpoint, the entire sense that you should interpret history through this spiritual background is being removed. We already discussed this in the Historian playlist. On the other hand, it's important to draw considerations from this same kind of more material side of the story, simply because it matches the spiritual one, right? It doesn't. What strikes you of that historiography is that it doesn't provide with real answers, right? It just describes what happens and doesn't give an explanation. I think everything I published so far referred to the sense of moral forces, right? The more you leave, actually, it's not just about studying history. And the more you see how powerful, really, the sense of burnout or hype and whatever really can be in a system, right? A materialist would just say, well, this is essentially entropy increasing, and you can't really do much about it because things cannot be put together once again, physically speaking, because they reason from the standpoint of just some molecules that are there doing, being moved by mere energy. But when conscience, life, right? So something that we have practically no clue scientifically what the hell it is comes into play, and you realize what from this, in theory, total chaos, completely random picture, things can be put together once again. You start realizing that the history of civilization is the single most, say, magical aspect, like together with life herself, like in terms of how much do actions matter, right? On the other hand, in this sense, you have to think that the humanity as a fallen kind has always run short of the expectations. So we've seen how Rome has, in this sense, gone beyond this as with no other comparison, just possibly Alexander, but we're talking about Alexander, we're not talking even about an empire that would last as much as the one of Rome, but in the time and the place where this occurred, right? And there the scale is, again, unrepeated, fundamentally, because it doesn't matter how big larger other empires later were, either they lasted much less and they had, or they had much more, much greater means, right, that were, however, countered by other polities at the time that limited their own expansion. So that's why we have to come back also to the early empire, because it starts feeling, even from, I've always been interested, as you know, in ancient history, but as a medievalist, like there was a time which I said, okay, I don't have to study that. But you kind of always come back to it, because ancient history is not just, of course, the cause of what happened later, but it also helps dramatically in a comparative sense to understand the achievements of a polity and another, right? So speaking of the Roman attitudes to warfare, we have to highlight, of course, that there have been some even useful, partially, of course, useful studies of the Roman mentality. This is particularly easy to do, at least, considering the historiographical standards for the times and places. For example, the late Republic, right? The military ethos of, say, Caesar's legionnaires. Well, it's something you can really document consistently, and we hopefully will, because we have to reinforce, really. I wouldn't really talk so much about Roman history. This is always the feeling for any history that we discussed on Schwerpunkt, but in general, sometimes I feel like I'm skipping also the obvious, right? Talking about archaic warfare for Roman history is really, again, crucial. Like the Genesis, the beginning, the spring, how this thing started in the first place. It's something that deserves much greater recognition than is usually done, right? I can't stress enough how many, living out there, people would know everything about the early imperial, Roman legion and everything, but if you ask them about the literal ABC of archaic history, they don't even know what happened, right? The essentials. And part of the fault of this is again the fact that, say, that the historiography hasn't stressed enough the moral side of the story, because when you do not have explicit explanations and you try to convince someone that that is somehow important, but why? After all, the empire was bigger later, right? Why would this be important, even just historically speaking? Then you have a severe problem of properly cognitive capacities that have been erased. The cause, effect, consequence. What that this was part of a broader whole again in a space where the empire had not existed prior, right? Rome wouldn't substantially expand in the wake of another empire as a whole, right? Taking the place we've seen, I don't know, in Mesopotamia, how many empires ruled over Mesopotamia and made it the center of their power. Rome created something unknown, right, for the world before. She ruled also from Mesopotamia, but ruling, the entire Mediterranean and the majority of that's surely the place, the most populated and and wealthier amount of Europe, the majority of it. So the question is, we just have to come back on. For the 4th century, all this interest in the mindset is much more arduous to satisfy, exactly because of the aforementioned little evidence, say, especially from documentary sources, right? Just read Livian, say, there is, Dumezil's Camillus, for example. There are really lots of great works about a Roman religion. That's probably the best one can start from. But once you have gotten the fundamentals about that, and you look at this time in history, you realize, well, after all, it's all much easier than it seemed, right? We've seen also this war machine developing over time, right? We have seen how loot, for example, was pretty stuck in Roman mentality in the 3rd century, 2nd century BC, still very much. There was this sense of, again, primitive, tribal, continental mentality that really, was pretty much aggressive and, warlike, in that, Rome can be seen as the broader extension of those movements we've seen from the steppes, right? Eventually settling in Europe and maintaining this kind of rapacious, which better symbol than the eagle in that regard, in like the sea peoples, right? Centuries before, just coming from the north across the sea and raiding and praying, right? The sense of probably the shift that Rome triggered in Mediterranean from the kind of the cult of the mother, right, of the chthonic Pelasgian forces, and to whom also other peoples had started kind of succumbing in a way. Made some videos about how this affected the Hellenic and Hellenistic civilization, and essentially shifted to the Uranian, virile, cold, violent side of the story, succeeding not just in conquering this world, but in transfiguring it itself. So the idea of the eagle falling on the prey, and the ingravidation of the fundamentally of the female prey, which is the actual deal of this all. Think about Roman Carthage, Ines and Dido, etc. Has all the the greatest traditional meaning you can find in ancient history, objectively. Now, the Roman conquest of Italy, as we've seen, really was the starting point of that. Lots of Italic peoples had already been shifting towards a sort of lunar feminine, as opposed to the original kind of virile and more warlike background. We've seen that the Etruscans fundamentally were already very telluric in nature. This left a mark in Rome herself. As we've seen, the plebs is necessary to be tamed and commanded for achieving the same transfiguration of the same with the Roman freemen, the Roman citizenry. provided with an imperium, and so on. So it was this constant need of resources, right, that would have to prove the success of Rome, right? And basically the empire stopped expanding only after 400 years of continuous conquests, because they overstretched their capacity. But strategically speaking, we've seen it in the video about this subject. They were always essentially controlling the peoples, say, within and outside, through this sense of perfect balance of forces. So strategically always being projected towards the further conquest, right? Differently from a defensivistic mentality that would kick in later. And yes, it is really a thing, right? At some point we will see it better. That I'm a great fan in many ways of the 4th century Constantinian army, but on the longer run things did change, and it's not really an old sounding historiographical interpretation. It is something that really impacted morally, strategically, and this applied by that point to for Rome, for the rest of the world, right? What could be achieved even by the offensive on the other side was minimal, because the world had run out of resources fundamentally in the first place. Now, the sense of especially going at war every year, right? We have seen 137 years of war, over 150 during this period, right? Obviously, help to profile the Roman mentality, right? War would have been essentially a normal, as unavoidable hazard, but also, accomplishment by a degree of life. There was the sense again that this Latin youth was still doing essentially now in a more orderly and disciplined and effective and bloody way what the tribe, the tribal war bands tradition of the Italic world had been doing, right? Like as the Celts did and other peoples. So that's also a piece that we miss because we don't have much about that previous background, even though we know perfectly was there archaeologically and through still older mythological reminiscences. It's all very clear, anthropologically speaking. So we don't have the mathematical evidence of at least the precise extent to which military service impinged upon the Roman freemen in the 4th century. We can start getting that much better, and we will hopefully get to that point for the Middle Republic. This is depending on how you really periodize it, but obviously for the late Republic, mostly, right? Because actually for the early Empire, we have slightly less, actually, than even the Middle and the late Republic, in spite of the greater development. There are reasons. This is something that happened similarly to, I don't know, classical Greece by a degree. I mean, we know much better about hoplitic warfare than the Macedonian one. With Rome, it's something in between, actually, but still the trend is the same. But also for obvious reasons that we explained, especially as far as the mechanisms of land exploitation, recruitment, and debt, and enslavement, etc. Land occupation, property was concerned, colonization, etc. There were also ups and downs. Indeed, there was a 2nd century BC crisis, right? So Rome at some point did act, if not defensively, but at some point had to still show that got it. Like that's why they razed to the ground Carthage or destroyed Corinthus, and so on. But aside from that, for later periods, we have an idea still of how concrete the military service for the average Roman freeman really was, right? I decided I will start to use the term freeman because it seems to me that the citizen is too bureaucratic as a concept. Not that it wasn't used in the sense of kivas and how deeply so in an identitary sense, but the idea, especially for the 4th century, is that we're talking about freemen. We're talking about people that are provided as such with the imperium because they can't participate to the army in the first place, which was the great step forward, as we've seen, of the plebs and the surpassing of the feudal army just by the greater patrician clans, right, as it had been at the beginning, and the takeoff of Rome accordingly. So if we look, for example, at not even much later times than these ones, but we stop to the 3rd century usually when scoping this archaic times, and by 225 BC, for example, it's been calculated with some good degree of approximation that of all the adult male freemen, 17% were legionnaires, right? In 213, so we are at the peak of the Second Punic War, these increased to 29%, right? So if you consider in the Roman army, you would count 13% of all citizens, right? This it could be say that this percentage can be raised, for example, in terms of age segmentation, probably something as 84% of the 17-year-olds for 5 years, right? And 60% for 7 years, or 44% for 10 years, or 28% for 16 years were at war. So as we've seen, this military development had gone in parallel with the surpassing, also together with feudal, also seasonal warfare, right? The idea that soldiers appeared just as professionals in Marian times is just wishful thinking. Essentially, it's from the 4th century that the idea of a force essentially abroad, and from the 3rd century overseas, actually, on a regular basis, is already established. And of course, the state already provides for at least part of the equipment. There's never been such a thing like the average Romano-Italic farmer leaving with all his cheese and sausages on his back, just for saying, okay, well, to the wife, I'll just go to war with my own resources and I'll come back just with them. Of course, everything was already managed from quite an early age, from the same feudal times, right? Again, it's the patricians that fundamentally, the senatorial elite at least, that puts together these forces, equips them, trains them, and it's the same people that run the state, right? And that are decide to go at war, and that, as we've seen, received an enormous popular support for this enterprise, because it was the measure through which the plebs could, in fact, promote the entire system and themselves in the process by getting new land and making, as we've seen, this incredible amount of wealth, slaves, etc., land in their hands. So these numbers are really eloquent, because you realize that there were Roman freemen that had quite a degree of military experience, a multi-year one, right? And it would have not been so rare at all, right, to have served even more than 10 years, right? This picture would be, let's say, more evident in fact, we're talking about data from the Second Punic War, right? And it would stabilize later on because of the continuity of Roman overseas occupation, at least, when not conquest. With all the issues again of the 2nd century BC, the recruitment crisis, and the necessity of the Marian reform that was fundamentally just opening the enlistment, regardless basically of any other class or kind of political connection. Just again on for every Roman citizen without limitations, and for being at that point completely supplied by the state, or better at that point the oligarchies, the Roman warlords that had been still controlling and consolidating the power on the Senate. As far as the 4th century BC is concerned, we have a bit more problems to calculate the same numbers, right? Because the urbs was objectively smaller. Just as we've seen it from the beginning to the end of the century, you pass fundamentally to the major city in Latium, but within Latium, together with other allies, fundamentally, that still, at least up to some point, had their own saying, to basically the conquest of most of central and southern Italy, with the final consolidation in the 3rd century, right? Essentially the war with Pyrrhus finally, and then you have the Punic Wars overseas. So at the beginning of the 4th century BC, we or even just at the end of it, we're not so sure. We can't measure everything with clarity. However, some hints may help defining better the overall dimension, right? First of all, it's intuitive to start with to think that by the times of the Second Punic War, a lower proportion of Roman citizens was involved in war than it had been the case during the Fourth. Right? Again, we've seen the peak during Hannibal's invasion of mobilized citizens and allies and so on. Here we're talking fundamentally about Roman citizens, right, specifically. But the numbers can be easily, in this sense, mutuated for the allies as well. In the 4th century BC, the community was smaller, was thus more also actually fighting against arguably a greater threat, or at least it needed to fight against a greater amount of enemies. They were also relatively similar to the Romans themselves. I mean, Hannibal was surely one of the greatest geniuses in military history, but at the end of the day, as we all know, his resources were limited, and so on. So as we've seen, the Romans just steamrolled instead in ferocious and incredibly brutal and bloody wars, right? So understanding also that the amount of, we don't know excessively about that, but even just think about the losses in the Roman army, right? Apparently, who hates Rome always thinks that the Romans threw just people at the enemy, and that there was a massive bloodshed of Romans, and instead the tribesmen, because they ate more meat or this bullshit, they died in less numbers. Actually, it was the other way around, and I think basically the entire Roman military history shows this from sources and any other archaeological evidence, including the famous deserts that the Romans made of the others, on a macroscopical scale, right? And really unchangeable one, right? There is not a terrible conspiracy of the evil Romans that changed the history because the winners write history and all these things for lesser people. Here we're talking about real history, right? The ones for mentally healthy people and literate people and, worth of the name of people. We know that basically Rome just broke through massive amount of warriors, of peoples, of resistance, and that this attrition naturally did produce losses, but obviously to a degree that just by sheer numbers. Again, Rome started by being one city, right? They took over the world. That city was not concentrating, the same amount of people or more than the ones that the Romans conquered, right? We know this pretty concretely from a demographic and just kind of economical point of view, right? The ancient world, the Iron Age, is not like a place where you can say, oh, but it's technology, man, because the Romans had technology, damn that technology. No, they were technologically advanced, there is no doubt, but that's something you have to build, right? And you must draw from a background that is made of manpower, that without which no technology can function, nor there aren't magic, ballistas that take out 50 enemies a shot, right? Just for making you whine about the poor barbarians that got slaughtered by the Romans. The Romans were just the same barbarians, except they succeeded and the others failed, right? And became Romans, in case you didn't notice, aside from the ones that surely were exterminated in the process. And Romans kept doing the same thing, by the way. So the concept is definitely that there was a much greater involvement of the average freeman in warfare during the 4th century, right? Livy, for example, it's just a hint, like an example on what we base ourselves on. For 295, seems to confirm such enormous amount of relative involvement, right, for the size of Rome at the time. That is to say, 6 legions were put into the field, right? So, in theory, at that point, the legion, I will not digress on all the issue between Servian, Camillian, Livian, Polybian, because it's all much simpler than it sounds. On paper, on parchment, at that point, it would have been, or papyrus, if you prefer, the Roman legion had to count something like 6,000 men. We understand that by Polybian times, so essentially by the time of the Punic Wars, this had fallen to 1,300, right, for reasons we will see in another video, or right, these say full strength legions were often depleted just in the moment of the recruitment, and even more during the campaign, right? So it's completely normal to have had far lesser numbers, right? But if we mediate this with an actually high estimate of the Roman population at the time, such as 144,000 men, well, we would make, by the beginning of the 3rd century BC, at the time of Sentinum, in fact, in the Libyan example, 1/4 of the Roman adult males serving in that year in the army, right? And consider this also from a strategic point of view, because, as you know, the Battle of Sentinum was a turning point where basically all the Italian peoples had coalesced against Rome. There were the Celts, the Samnites, etc. Rome consistently risked not to make it at that point. As you know, the battle was a crushing Roman victory that fundamentally opened to that final consolidation of the of the extremely courageous, by the way, as Pyrrhus and Hannibal find out, Romano-Italic confederacy. And strategically speaking, 1/4 of the troops actually deployed, right, means that you are outstretching your literal, demographic capacity in order to have some reserves at one point to even defend the Roman territory in case those forces, at least in good part, would be annihilated. So an enormous involvement that also shows how actually difficult for Rome it was, at least how, of course, difficult, but how much effort properly Rome put in order to achieve this result. The Roman conquest of Italy was definitely not a walk in the woods, right? You don't come out psychologically the same after storming a Samnitic hilltop, right? And what Rome achieved this was done through an incredible, sense, as we will see, because there is this fact, was Rome the aggressor? By which degree, right? As we've seen, the Romans started essentially expanding in Italy while their own territory was under pressure from the usual, again, mountaineer kind of expansion with war bands to through the valleys towards the coastlands, and just the Romans, the Latins, would take a liking, right, for such expeditions in a sort of tit-for-tat game that simply, was not to end just by this or that war, right? So especially the Italian hinterland as a whole is not really, again, a place you can't simply say, okay, well, we just conquered this city, the rest will just obey without any problem. No, it's Southern Europe has, I don't know, between the Iberian Peninsula or the Italian one or the Balkans, which is the most nightmarish battleground in European history. Surely the Romans had their share experience in that regard in the conquest of the Apenninic Peninsula. And 1/4 of the adult males serving, right, we're talking the adult males. So, of course, and probably there was a higher proportion of youth, but it's still very high considering that, it's the entire male population in the first place. Talking about freemen. And as we've seen also in the previous videos, there was exactly in these years an anxiety to kind of enlisting the freedmen too in the army. That's also an interesting aspect of the story, because manpower was really in battles to be won again against enemies that were pretty much at this point, perhaps there is a moment, of course, the earlier you go back in time, the more similar Roman warfare is to the one even of the Oscans, etc. At this point, surely Rome had fully, we know that from the late 4th century, from the Livian description, in fact, the Manipular Legion was there, fully formed. So, albeit, surely there wasn't a radical difference from kind of heavy infantry battle surrounding people. Surely the Samnites wouldn't fight in the same identical way. Sure, though, Rome was just training ever more allies, just her own way, right? And gradually, by the time of the Second Punic War, we know that there was no difference anymore. But we're talking about those, in fact, systems that were already within Rome, right? The tribe could not feel something like what Rome could feel, because it would have been just organically too small as such. So guerrilla would have been, at that point, in an occupied area, the only resource. That's why I stress this difference. But that came together with Romanization, and through, as we've seen, the incredible resistance that not just the Romans, but the majority of the Italics and other peoples in Italy put up against the Carthaginians and their allies. So it's true, Livy's evidence may not be fully reliable with these numbers for 295 BC, but in general, considering the circumstances of the campaign and Battle of Centenum, that it is a bit, again, the climatic year of the Roman conquest of Italy, well, surely Rome would have put up an unprecedented war effort, right? So the fact that Livy records such numbers is not just anecdotal, right? It may just be, again, he was reasoning maybe mathematically, the 6,000 men from the alleged, Serbian reform and so on. But again, the amount of manpower deployed was enormous, and likely at that point, yes, the highest in previous Roman history, right? And it is by itself an indication of the great extent to which fighting must have affected the average male freeman in these years. This is an aspect that has been debated by the new military history, because they, surprise, discovered that in order to kill a person in hand-to-hand combat, you must have a very specific psychophysical condition, right? You must come from a background that really makes it natural, right, to a degree that we have forgotten. And this is perhaps, however, still the single most, the single least researched military topic, historiographically speaking. And it's something the average person doesn't want to investigate, because that would be the scale of their own human failure, right? People managed to do these things back in the day, and today we don't even want to face the fact that we're losing capacity of doing anything in general, psychophysically, because we must pretend at least that nothing changed, not to realize how much we are collapsing. So let's say whether Levy's numbers are correct or not, probably 20,000-30,000 men under arms centurion times are correct, right? And it's still a pretty large amount, as we've seen, of the Roman citizenry that is not actually distant from even Libyan numbers, and it makes sense even just for the average, that in the ancient world we could put together for an effective operational deployment for major campaign, climatic pitch battle, and so on. That it shows definitely the face of a militarized society, right, to say the least. Let's talk about the mindset here, because the Romans would start celebrating their own military achievements, especially from the peak of their essentially late 4th, early 3rd century BC success, right? So a time in which practically the Romans reached an unprecedented amount of military capacity that they used successfully, right, to win and to affirm themselves as basically the nascent Mediterranean empire. And in the process, they would, and this is understandably from a political or sociological or even psychological point of view, as the ones who were objectively superior to anybody else, right? It's likely that, of course, the Romans already had this deeply ingrained in mind, especially the elite, right? But, for example, the Roman triumph as the most characteristic, practically, celebration of this military ethos, stands out in these years, right, to an unprecedented frequent and also definition of the property of Roman and celebration of Roman imperialism, right? We do not have, we know the Romans did celebrate triumphs since ever, right? This was a thing that, anthropologically speaking, you can find in many places and times. The Romans had their own, except we do not have such detailed descriptions of a 4th or 5th century BC Roman triumph. Right, for the years of the Second and the Third Samnite Wars and of the Pyrrhic War and its aftermath, so the final affirmation of Rome over the entirety of the Italian peninsula, you have the greatest display of triumphs in the entire history of the Roman Republic. That is to say, not even later, right? If not just basically at the beginning of of the Augusta, say Caesar times, Augustus times, you have the same amount of celebrated triumphs. And the interesting difference is also that by the 4th century, the 3rd century, the triumph was a much more deeply felt deal compared to the already more secularized and modernized celebration of the late Republic, of the early Empire. That was actually still a big deal, especially if we were to witness one today. Right, the religious meaning, the hidden references, the entire procedure was something lost properly in the midst of history. You know that by the time of Cicero and Caesar, you say that even the meaning of the archaic Roman religion, in many ways, was blurred. Right, the Romans were aware. First of all, they knew much more about it than they wrote about. For us, naturally, to reconstruct. But they themselves, of course, didn't have a thorough, historiographical or, just historical awareness of how, like, just with the current, at least, anthropological or history of religion, or etc., and philological means of today. So if they had been exposed to, as they were, to those particular cults, that kind of the rites, the meaning of them, they would surely be quite eloquent about what it was. But the multiplicity, like the complexity of it, especially considering the size that Rome had reached, etc., was a huge deal. It couldn't quite be simply tracked. There were major deities. As I often say, there is no such thing like a time in which monotheism appeared. The entire universal religion is founded exclusively on the unitary divine idea, right? There is only one God, right? And all the rest is nothing but an hypostasis of it. Any other religion, polytheism never existed, historically speaking, from a religious point of view. And so they had, of course, lots of values and meaning. It was all something to explain, again, culturally, anthropologically, etc., what was the meaning of this deity or this other in this mechanism. That's the real thing to describe, not what does this God protect or not, but how does it fit in the entire deal that the triumph basically mimicked of transfiguration, right? The commander becoming God himself, and for a while, at least rendering the spoils of war to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and so returning to God, which of course is just God's, because there is no, which sounds very Christian, but again, Christianity is the same identical religion. There was no other religion in the world at the time. It was all one. We are the imbeciles today that actually believe that there were different religions, that the Christians arrived. That's the measure of human failure, of neo-paganism, of this kind of, trash. It's zero. It's the complete and most total religious and historical illiteracy, traditionally, spiritually, of any kind, right? The triumph was thus an enormously solemn occasion, right? In this in this institution, you would properly reach the closest, right, to God that was ever, this would actually occur on the battlefield, right? And hopefully that's the place where transfiguration should have occurred. But what you're actually taming doesn't matter how, surely dangerous. It's just a coalition, right, of different peoples. It's not the entire world. So it's just going transfiguring bit by bit, but having still this element of divine in some measure within your veins, right? Everything went in parallel with a genetic, right, sense of superiority. The idea again, the Romans were actually very. The other lies that they actually all races were nobody was discriminated for, but that's the other lie that again nationalism and or socialism has indoctrinated you to think, because basically it equated racism to a sort of zoological materialism for which everything else spiritually it would be detached, right? And so this is also a completely alien concept to any kind of antiquity that we know from actual scientific and moral acquisitions. The Romans were extremely brutal, also simply for their own background, right? These Italic peoples, aside from their origin, it could be mountaineers, they could live now just in cities as well, but they were tougher, kind of more violent, more select, so physically select people than say the ones inhabiting an Hellenic colony in southern Italy. There was something incredibly primitive and bloodthirsty into properly the Romans were fond with decapitations. They had and that's a sacred kind of, but first of all, it's the only way you can kill, you can put to death a Roman citizen, because you have to respect the divine nobility that he has in bearing arms. That's what it means to be a Roman civis. It's not just going to vote. It's properly understanding that you're touching somebody that belongs to God, right? To the chosen people that has to conquer the world by divine mandate. That's how they reason, right? And all this was, you understand also how brutal the conflicts, not just with other peoples, also within the same Roman domestic affairs, because what was at stake was practically that, and the triumph was meant to prove that moral and material superiority of Rome over the other peoples, of the commander over the other Romans. And there would be much to say about that, because again the citizens were not, as you know, equal at all, not just in the classes of recruitment, but also in the degree in which or the, let's say, the direction in which the armament would go, like from the people or from the state, right? The equites, the knights, were thought to be more sacred than other citizens, right? At least more than the plebeians. There was something about that kind of, again, steppes, kind of Caucasian world that was exalted about equestrian warfare. And as I continuously, I will always take the chance of saying, the Romans had a hell of a powerful cavalry. They just had a few of that, but the ones they had were pretty darn good, and they cared extremely about this. The triumph itself involved, as you know, the biga with two white horses, which is the full symbol of the achieved Uranian deal. They couldn't have a black horse and a white horse, because the black horse would have meant that you were still struggling, like on Plato's, in fact, biga. And instead, at that point, the other horse has become white again because it's being transfigured divinely. And the ovation that is also, as now we will count how many of these celebrations occurred, was the same, except it wasn't. It was a minor thing, and it kind of was made to rejoice, kind of to celebrate this power and to test the kind of the pulse of the people itself, right? Of Rome herself. And the guy came on horseback, but there was all symbology involving there, again, the sense of almost transfiguration and the various degrees that this entire world revolved around. That's what they actually believed, right? While taking over this world, because they actually believed in the fact that this transfiguration would happen. And they lived in a world in which the awareness of the sacred was present. And today there is no such thing. We live in a constant materialistic superstition. The current political orientation doesn't have any of that, right? That's why I always say that you talk nationalism or socialism, you think about cats and dogs, but they're just the same, just different degree of step towards communism and towards what the Romans thought that basically equated to death of anything and the destruction of your own soul, devoured by the deities of the underworld, and the failure in succeeding in the transfiguration, which was meant to be also ecumenic in nature. That's why everybody wanted to conquer the world at the time, because it was the only way to save anyone in the process. And no order would have made sense. Not the imperium, nor slavery, nor anything, nor of this hierarchy would have made sense. And this was the human meaning of the time. So if we were to count banally the amount of triumphs during more or less this, let's say, Republican times. Also, the Republic never existed, in case you wonder, but by approximation, that's what we call it. Like, we can see between 312 and 293, 18 triumphs. So once a year. These are recorded by the Triumphal Fasti, by the way. And here I'm counting, first of all, I'm counting only, of course, just the ones we know about. So throughout these years, we will see there may have actually been more, just we do not know that. And ovations are counted together with triumphs, right? There is, for example, the ones also not carried out in Rome, but on the Alban Mount, listed by the Fasti. The Alban Mount had been the seat, as you know, of essentially the most important sanctuary of Jupiter, like the one that protected the entire Latium, right? So it was a huge deal, one of the single most sacred places on Earth. And that Rome, even as, deeply believing in herself, not much in these other Latin neighbors that she had fundamentally hegemonized, but understood that there was a greater power, a greater tribute, let's say, to make towards this deity, right? So it counts pretty much the same, considering the solemnity of the issue. And even the ovations, again, are really pretty much in tune with the same idea, the emphasis, exaltation, and glorification of the leaders, because everything was based again on this incredibly brutal hierarchy that from the Roman sagas emerges exactly in these. Think about the devotio and the idea that you would kill even your own son as a consul if he had disobeyed to you, because otherwise Rome could not win, right? The entire traditional meaning of life is that you cannot do anything wrong, because everything you do wrong is against God. And so your actions must be perfect. And if you go against the hierarchy must prove to be stronger than you. And in that sense, if it is put into discussion for the highest standards humanly possible, you have to sacrifice so much, right? The theme of sacrifice is everywhere, as you know, also in the Bible, etc. You cannot achieve anything if you do not sacrifice something, right? And it's an equivalence, except you get more eventually of something supernatural that you cannot quantify, but will actually happen, materially speaking, as well. Will have it will just happen by itself, just on the basis of the righteousness of your actions. And so imagine again a city like Rome that had accomplished what it had accomplished exactly, in such, in just several generations, exiting Latium and taking over the entire Italy, how much this was unequivocally felt as fulfilling God's mission. Then we have from 282 and 264, 22 triumphs. So 22 in 19 years. Comparatively, so this is until the First Punic War, as you understand. Comparatively, if you look at the dates from 367 to 13, you have only 27 of these celebrations, 8 between 329 and 313, 30 between 264 and 222, right? So it's still a lot, but diluting after the First Punic War. 16, the beginning of it, 16 between 178 and 155, 17 between 126 and 104, and only after 45 we see actually the rate of essentially the beginning of the 3rd century BC being met again, with 17 triumphs listed between 45 and 34 BC. So you understand here we are really in other times between Caesar's assassination and the Battle of Actium, basically. And at the time, the triumph has become more pro forma. Again, the Romans have this. They have this just as a political tool. It's very important. It's deeply felt. They perfectly know what it means. But this peak from the late 4th and the beginning of the 3rd century BC is never replicated, and probably because at that point the Romans were at the highest of their exaltation for the achievement in itself. So consider the time scan here, right? What we consider the peak of Roman greatness is the 2nd century AD, right? The Romans were pretty well aware of the fact that something had occurred back in the day, in those glorious times, where they had actually made the greatest effort and they had gotten the greater result. It was much easier for Rome to conquer, a province in Mediterranean, in Europe, say in the 1st century BC, in the 1st century AD, right? They had an incredibly powerful system with, centuries old, in fact, professional military with, that basically nobody could match. And just, it was about not necessarily even there simply walking in, right? But almost in perspective to what they had been able to do during the 4th century BC. And seeing it this from the perspective of a Roman must have really struck some chords, because again, it's as if there had been a mythical past, right? In part, the West has also lived through this, right? Today, up to, again, 200, 300 years ago, when people were really traditionalist, Rome was the paradigm of the entire Western tradition, the most important one, even before, in a sense, even before Alexander, even before the Greeks. There was something about Rome that's the reason why we basically picked at least her symbols, even if some of them were identical with Greece, with any other Indo-European people, from her, right? This, again, I did not explain why this happened in the Middle Ages. We know what, say, the division between something more narrowly Western European and the rest has occurred. But the point being that, in part, we actually share, at least for the few people with an actual satisfactory education. And no, even sometimes being a PhD doesn't mean that you have one, right? And I can say that, definitely. Is somehow living, right, in the nostalgia of the same Roman tradition, right? It's kind of looking at these times of Camillus, of the great heroes of Rome, right, and saying, we were that at some point, right? Again, ever since nationalism and socialism kicked in, those standards have collapsed, right? But not even during the Reformation, people disdained the Romanity, or thought that, I don't know, what was happening, among peoples that objectively didn't achieve what Rome achieved, but also that we couldn't even adequately document, was more important, like the average idiot really believes today, on the base of basically no moral scientific objectivity. And I was too part of this at some point. I also believe that, okay, yes, there is being Rome, it's being great, it's been so important, but there were kind of other peoples that did this, right? With exception, as you know, I've been expanding into China a bit, but I've seen a much less kind of spiritual dimension there, at least in a traditionally, oriented sense compared to the Roman achievements. The Chinese were very successful in some fields, no doubt more successful than the Romans, but overall their empire was not the achievement of the Roman one, right? If anything, for a matter of unity, China was considered, as you know, the name as everything under heaven. So it's as if they had thought of it as the world, not as, let's say, different parts of China ruled in a way. Rome was always Rome, right? It wasn't a diversion from that. The people that did this were the actually original ones, plus all those naturally that they had conquered, but that substantially wouldn't. And this was the deal of Rome, even later times, even when Constantinople was refounded, let's say, from Byzantium, that nobody could fundamentally find another center but Rome. The same goes for the Holy Roman Empire, and more. So it's really something we lost a couple hundred years ago, right? Before that, the West lived entirely on this notion. Bear it in mind before when you come across that content that wants to say, but the historians just flatter Rome. There was nothing special about it. No, likely, if anything, there is nothing special about you. And that's what traditional Europeans, traditional Westerners actually believed, quite straightforwardly. And there is a reason if things, as they believed at the time, tend to go worse, right? And constantly, because of our own shortcomings, right? So, triumphs becoming essentially an emblem of moral superiority, something that starts really at the end of this great Roman conquest of Italy. The same goes for the cult of Victoria. This is yet another interesting aspect that, as we will see, intersects also with the history of Alexander the Great and the impact that he had also on Rome at the time. Because, as you know, we're in the same years almost. We note that, speaking of the same timeline, we have a statue erected in 305 to Hercules. That, of course, is a god associated with victory. We know from other sources, such as Dio and Zonaras, that there were some prodigies associated with the statue of Victoria in Rome. Then there was the vow to build a temple to Jupiter Victor, right? Remember the story of the hypostasis. Jupiter is the Father, Victoria is the Holy Ghost, and the Triumphator is the Son, right? And the deal being, of course, that there is this, it's the Holy Trinity of Catholicism. I mean, it's the idea that The Holy Ghost is your own spark of divinity that, however, belongs as your soul to your fallen condition. And if you struggle and win, you can elevate yourself, coming back to God as one. This is the meaning of the Holy Trinity. Of course, the Romans believed in the same identical thing, by the way. This is the entire meaning, basically, of the Indo-European and any other, basically, universal creed that existed at the time. The Greeks believed the same thing, right? For example, the Romans adopted in 293 BC the Hellenic practice of wearing laurels at the games, because games were also a sort of competition, right? They were not really disjointed from war, right? Actually, war was thought to be a game, and vice versa. This is also actually the Clausewitzian definition. War is a game both objectively and subjectively, and there is a very specific reason, that is the nature of gamble, especially of the second person of the Trinity, that is the military one, right? The idea that you have to essentially risk in order to accomplish anything. Remember the sacrifice? In 294, the Romans dedicate a temple of Victoria. The silver quadrigati portrait the statue of the Ogulni with Jupiter followed by Victoria also are something that probably was connected with, as we'll see now, the cult of Nike, from that was a quite fashionable thing since the time of Alexander and his successors, right? And about this, people said, but maybe the Romans took this really from the Greeks, right? Well, in their symbology, this thing existed since prehistory, right? You know, all the Indo-Europeans had the same identical symbology, with just minor variations on the base of the species of the actual animals that you're looking at, right? In various areas, as opposed to from the forests to the steppes, there is the bear as opposed to the wolf, and so on. But, you know, as you see in Rome, the wolf is always there, as in other, also in the Norse world, etc. Some people said that basically Rome knew very well what Alexander was doing, and Alexander, naturally, as being the Magus, is, you know, I've never actually had the courage to make a video about Alexander and his the broader political meaning, because it's just too much, right? It's just too great. It's just the you know, humanly wise, the single most important thing probably that ever happened, individually speaking, in the history of mankind. And Alexander had his own myths, right? The Greeks were obsessed with Achilles. That they all stem from all these narratives, just like the Romans remembered their Romulus and so on. But the idea that Victoria, especially, starts popping up exactly towards the period of the Samnite War, so actually during Alexander's conquests, and with such a potent symbol of conquest in that Roman conquest of Italy, makes you really believe it was an autochthonous thing. It was, again, a universal cult, but it was, let's say, booming among the Romans, because there is also this other, exactly in that period, there's also another concept, that is to say, the peoples who had not yet achieved something great, right, usually didn't have the symbology, right? If you look at the rest of Europe, you do find eagles and stuff, but to a much lesser degree, right? The chthonic element, the Dionysian dimension, the telluric aspects, the darker necrophagus animals are basically more prevalent. It's just like with Rome before even the affirmation of the eagle as the most superior symbol in maritime, because bearing the symbol of something that was not, matching your status, essentially God's birth, the highest creature in these mythologies, was considered a sacrilege, right? So it's not just about self-celebration, it is also about how much you have actually achieved, and whether it makes even sense to claim that you have won something if you haven't really accomplished that much, right? And considering the traumatic amount of Italian states and tribes that were succumbing exactly in those years to Rome, of course, we can't go as far as saying that at least by the 90s of the 3rd century, looking at these dedications, the timeline, the temples, and so on, that Victoria had already become, from a substantial while, and had fully been ingrained as the greatest symbol of the Roman Imperium. So this is not just about imperialism. This is not about saying, but these Romans, why did they think it? Do you realize what they had actually achieved? Right? So I will not digress now the sidebar on Alexander and his personal achievement versus what happened after his death. So, but as I said at the beginning of the video, Rome is unique in archive because this thing was to stay for quite a long time. So when Fabius Rullianus, consul, and the campaign of Sentinum, vowed to essentially Victoria, because Jupiter Victor basically was the one who would grant the Holy Ghost, would grant victory to the commanders. Well, obviously this is not a coincidence, right? The Romans were already dramatically aware of what was at stake, and they were essentially following the rhythm, the path, the scale of their own accomplishments in order to crown themselves with the winged victory. So hardly anything Alexandrian here. That in fact, is also more mitigated, right? I made couple of videos about Macedonian symbolism, and there is a lot of that. There is always the globe, the sun, but the eagle specifically, right, is more rapacious symbolism, and the concept of victory, the Nike as such, it is to be found in Alexandrian times, don't get me wrong, but the way that would become prominent, like in Rome, is not quite the same thing. It's not quite the same way. And by the way, the Romans were still very, say, provincial in their expansion, meaning that they hadn't even quite ever met any Macedonian. They would in a couple of decades on the battlefield. They would remain somehow, cautious before the Second Macedonian War, right, when they actually took over the same Macedon, so that opened to further series of affirmation, not just of assertion internationally. So we can really find various evidence about this further for the pre-Hellenistic, let's say, dimension of Rome. For example, there was an abortive attempt of Publius Decius Mus to devote himself at the Battle of Ausculum. Right, it shows that whether or not they really devoted themselves, the deaths of his father at Sentinum and grandfather of Decius Mus at they were called same way at Vezaris, the Vesuvian foothills, were already part of the Roman military legion. The idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of, I will literally transcend myself, right, in order to achieve victory. It was already a thing from burial time. It was not like a product of later Roman historiography at the time of the apotheosis, etc. This thing was already there, and we know, just religiously speaking, it was a bit like the single most important thing of all these people since they were just tribesmen, and we do not practically know anything about those kind of cults. Another hint is the Roman obsession for single combat, the idea of championship, right? The fact that the Romans would keep representing themselves as battle champions, slaughtering in single combat their enemies, taking their spoils, essentially considering that as a sort of human sacrifice to God. The spolia opima were literally that, like in less civilized times, where they just would bring the corpse of the enemy, the head, whatever, as a human sacrifice to God. The arms, of course, and as you know, this iconography lasts basically throughout all the entire, the entire Republic. And in imperial time, things are so beyond that there is already properly a much more explicit heavenly symbolism, and with also the deification of past emperors, etc. But we will see. I made a video about that for in the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So if you check that out, perhaps it will be clearer to you. We observed that one of such champions, Valerius Corbus, won an early consulship as a result of prowess displayed as a single fighter, which is, for the time being, still a proof of how archaic the Roman military context really was. Right at this point, the Romans had a hell of an army, no doubt, but at the same Battle of Sentinum, the story of the deer, of the wolf, of the fawn, of the wolf, is actually a reference to these kind of battle champions that issued each other to single combat in front of the battle lines. We see even some helmets from slightly previous times really having this kind of berserker, I'd say Wolfednar kind of mentality of being literally having to transcend this beast-like dimension by slaughtering also the enemy and absorbing that and increasing your own force, and stepping up kind of the level of deification accordingly. The idea of being a good individual fighter was very important, definitely for a Roma of the 4th century BC, and surely also for great part of the 3rd century BC and beyond. Like, we don't see much this at work. It's obvious that when Rome becomes like a true empire with a permanent military and so on, it doesn't make any sense to send a general to risk his life in single combat. But at this point, it was quite frequent, right? It means that during battles, the figure of the commander was more than just, say, obviously wouldn't be just representative, right? Commanders at this point would fight, where another. They would keep on fighting for about Caesar, but as we've seen, the Greeks think about Alexander, Pyrrhus, sometimes to an enormous risk, but still, again, for a useful tactical purpose, right? Because their presence was required in melee, right? So entrusting the consulship, right? It was on the base of this single combat. It was still seen as a sort of interesting initiation, trial, a kind of worthiness for such higher honor and level of imperium, right? This makes you really reflect on the capacities of these leaders. There is an inscription of the 3rd century commemorating Cornelius Scipio Barbatus that had covered consulship in 292, that had this enormous desire for laus and gloria, so praise and glory. And this aspect is being debated because people want to know, especially as far as consulship is concerned, so the highest military command, as we've seen in here, how much this military competition would count, right? Postumius Megellus, in his triumph of 294, definitely had his personal prestige enhanced in spite of the opposition of the Senate, right? And therefore, you understand between the 4th and the 3rd century, the desire of reputation on the base of your martial skills was still quite high. The debate revolves around mostly, how tough was this competition among within the Roman leadership. Some people say, well, it was ferocious, right? It was due just to kind of, if you got the consulship, you really handled the public money, really, that were given to you to arm the legions, that you would get the loot. You would have the highest command, as a matter of fact, in the theater, and people would count on you essentially, on your own discretion, on your own authority, on your own decisions, and so on. We've seen also there were this new, let's say, plebeian families that, of course, in order to access consulship, were quite powerful actually on their own. And that surely had their own interests, as we've seen, in participating to the army for providing their clienteles with more land for more people. They were representing the multitude. So the idea is that there would be some substantial political feuding. On the other hand, we often see, until especially the 90s of the 3rd century BC, some leaders holding the consulship for 3, 4, even 5 times, which was a lot, arguably, that they're not really the norm per se. But this suggests also that there was surely there was a competition and conflict, etc., and political debate and so on. However, there was also a substantial fluidity in this order, right? If a commander was considered, in times of crisis, the idea of the metus hostilis, right? Politics should compact in front of the enemy, right? And that is the best recipe for military success. Rome, during the 4th century BC, was surely a community that had, as we've seen, a much clearer idea of of what was at stake in war, because simply the stakes were higher for them, right? It's not like, I don't know, in the 2nd century BC that people, that ruled Rome objectively didn't give a damn about Spain or about Numidia or about places that are just, nothing to them. They could just maybe, profit marginally from it, but what Rome controlled overall was much bigger than the single context. And you understand also how the same concept of triumph would be changed in that way. In the 4th century BC, Rome was really fighting for survival, right, against the threat of annihilation, which could have happened, right? And this surely brought the best commanders to be unanimous, at least more easily chosen, cooperatively, right, by the Roman establishment, by the Roman leaders, the Roman the sense of, again, also how, especially this, how military skilled this elite and how tested this elite really was in matters of war is revealed by, again, how involved Rome was in these wars. These men really were involved directly, as we've seen constantly in these expeditions, right? Even if probably there hadn't been such a threat, right, for Rome, given that like before, like these were the same people that still ruled the city, that still had that sense of glory, of of ambition, of reputation, of the same clans. So Rome would never be uninterested in war as a mean as a mean to an end. I mean, just look at Caesar, look at great generals that succeeded, militarily speaking, mostly for reason of internal prestige and affirmation. This was, of course, all one with the empire that was being formed, but of course, such a close relation, like it had existed between, say, greater awareness between of the connection between politics and the exercise of violence, like had existed in the 4th century BC, likely would never occur in Roman history again. At least it would never be so functional, it would never be so successful in relative terms. And it's definitely one of the single most, this is one of the single most neglected, aspects, in my opinion, of the rise of the Roman civilization. Having known how much they had risked at that time, how much they had accomplished, how confident they had grown of themselves for how they had managed to succeed, knowing how costly this thing, as we've seen in just terms of military service, this had been. As a consequence, you cannot quite appreciate the later Roman history, the Punic Wars, the expansion of the Mediterranean, etc., without having pondered this aspect, to say the least. So, a history of Roman expansion, not just from, again, legitimately, again, the beginning of the 3rd century BC is also the beginning of a full Roman history, and not something mixed between myth and history. But this myth and history is such just in a historiographical, literary sense, not because what happened, is fiction, right? We understand that what happened is exactly that, right? We know that Rome did what she did during the 4th century, and as we've seen also in the previous ones, she had always been at war, way or another. So this, when we get back to that point, we can do it, especially looking at some myths of the earliest Roman history. You can really look at how deeply ingrained the military logic was among these people, and how much their mythology was actually reflecting it, and how aware actually of the same mechanisms figures like Caesar or Augustus still were. Right, the video on the Fortuna Kaiser is quite eloquent. The entire, again, let's say, providential, evangelical ideology of Augustus is all within this awareness of something that the Romans had basically achieved historically already, right? Whereas we think that, again, Rome had to rise to a peak, right? But the early empire, but the Romans saw like their hegemony having already been established on the basis of what they had achieved in Italy. And they wouldn't really consider anyone later to their level, as they did with at least some Italian tribes, without even at that time admittedly much of a sense of inferiority or best of equality, or not even actually. Rome thought they were superior to everybody else. It would completely just take defeats, just as temporary, minor setbacks, right? But at least there was somebody that could compete with them, that had the opportunity of transfiguring in her stead, right? This was lost, right? So it would be really interesting to start appreciating Roman history as much as any history from the perspective of the protagonists, right? I hate those videos on YouTube that say let's make this battle. Now at this point, everything is the perspective of this side, right? Even on video games, this started from, I don't know, explaining just the strategy of one side, unavoidably having to tell the strategy of the other because of the laws of reciprocity of the Krieg, but saying, now let's look at the perspective of this guy, as if somebody deprived us of the perspective of somebody, because that's the whiny, complaining kind of side of the story here, that there are some peoples that have been belittled because the terrible winners wrote history in a terrible way, as if they hadn't even actually made the defeated better than what they actually were for notorious political reasons, as it often happened throughout all history, and actual defeated people writing the same history. I mean, look at Polybius, look at Flavius Josephus. As far as Rome is concerned, I mean, that's one of the dumbest things that unfortunately still circulates around. At this point, we have even stupid video games, FPSs without any kind of historical connection or tactical or strategic, complete, what is, strategy, what is collective discipline, what is, complex thinking. You just want to pick a gun and shooting random guys that respawn every, few seconds, right? That's what you want. This video, battle, or whatever, the perspective of this faction. How dumb have we got, right? When you have history, the past, the evidence, everybody can read Livy, everybody can taste that history to a level of detail that hopefully we will also get a bit more thoroughly into about this very topics and others. Like, it's disheartening, but it's also a reason, right? You know that at least talking about this stuff is, if anything, food for thought, right? And something that I really never hear around, and which is probably indirectly the reason also why I have such a few, subscribers and viewers, because at the end of the day, who cares about this stuff, right? That's the entire point. They made you saying, oh, but it's too difficult, I don't want to hear this. Why? Of course, if you have nothing to hook that at, because you have no background, of course you will never understand. You can't even listen for 30 times in a row, but these are our times. In any case, we will keep talking about the Roman conquest of Italy, and hopefully passing also to some other times. Pyrrhus, the Second Punic Wars. We'll talk also about Hellenistic warfare, Celtic warfare, and more. Of course, hopefully, at least, I count on doing it. For today, however, I stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I heartily thank you for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.